Something has returned that at one point didn't seem like it was going to be a major thing, but it's now coming in full force. And it's really an essential part of the drug war. And that thing is coercive treatment. The reason I say it's an essential part of the drug war is when you start saying to people, look, we don't want you to take drugs, or we don't want you to take the drugs the way you're taking them, you have to go into treatment, or then we're going to put you in jail. That's just the drug war rewarmed over. And lately, around the panic we have about drug deaths, pretty much everybody seems to be endorsing coercive treatment. Let me start by saying this isn't a backdrop where people are claiming, and I think you're going to talk about this a little bit, well, they're against the war on drugs. Possibly they even claim they're for harm reduction. But then they say, however, if we catch you and you're using drugs, or if we feel you're using drugs in the wrong way, you're going to have to go into treatment if you're going to stay out of jail. So who is for that now? I have often made the claim that progressives are remarkably prone towards forcing people into treatment because they tend to be great believers in the disease theory. And that is continuing to be true in the following ways. Notably, the minority mayors of San Francisco had police chief there, and likewise in New York, are now talking about forced treatment because there are large numbers of homeless people on the streets. And drugs seem to be an important part of that, especially in San Francisco. And so there's a tradition around that. When Ethan Nadelman first started talking about legalizing drugs, the community that was most against that was the Black community. And there's a congressman named Sellers in the Bronx who was really against it because their logic was, well, it's hurting our community the most. So it's great for you to talk about legalizing drugs. But then the argument became clear. Ethan made it, but it became obvious. People were all using drugs, but it was African Americans who were most likely to be in prison for that. And so the logic switched. Now we're in a situation where there was always a certain amount of denial in that, because not only were African Americans more likely and minorities more likely to be arrested, but they were, unfortunately, more likely to use drugs in a negative way, for reasons that anybody who follows us in the Life Process program understand, because when people's lives are more threadbare or they have fewer resources, they're going to be more prone to rely on drugs, whereas people who have more balanced opportunities are going to use drugs in a different way. And so the way that has always worked out is people have taken the worst examples of drug use, and those tend to be street users, and said, well, that's what drugs do. But it's an interaction between that's what drugs do for people in certain circumstances. So at this point in the discussion, I want to switch to something and maybe mention it, draw you in a little bit, Zach. The progressive position has been housing first. What does that mean to you? What is housing first, and why has that been the progressive position?
Oh, right. Well, housing, I mean, people who are homeless generally will take a home if they have one. And that's the foundation of living in some kind of a balance. You have, like with the Portland Hotel Society, I mean, somebody has a home, they have a basis, they have a home base and a basis for living, and then they can perhaps become stabilized. That's the idea. Very practical.
And it's very practical, and it's sort of the whole, in a way, it expresses the Life Process program. The Life Process program says, you need certain fundamental things, and then otherwise, A, your drug use or other behaviors are going to be likely to be negative and addictive, and B, you can only get out from under that if you're able to establish certain anchorage in life, in your life. And so, in a sense, we were matched up with the progressive movement because housing first was a big thing. It was a big module. And now people are explicitly stepping back from housing first. And I mentioned the black mayors, but it's more than that. Kevin Newsom is perhaps the most progressive major national spokesperson for the progressive point of view. He's the governor of California. He's talking about forced treatment. You had some insight into British Columbia, which is a whole other country, where the provincial governor is that who's the guy who's in charge of the province in Canada?
Yeah, the premier. I forget his name. Boy, I'm just gonna like put his name on the screen because I'm not gonna remember it. But it was about a year ago that he was full coerced treatment. Like we have this problem, and the reason this is happening and the way out of it. The reason it's happening is because these are people who are diseased. I mean, that's what he believes. And so these are people who need mental health care and largely are addicted. So these people need addiction treatment, and they're not going to get it on their own. We need to nudge them. So as a province wanted to push people into forced treatment. There was an article that came out last month in the Vancouver Sun saying, well, he's walked back his position. But he's only walked back his position enough to appease the people with pitchforks coming after him who are saying, coerced, what do you mean? But he still believes fundamentally, people who are living on the streets in Vancouver, and the reason there are big problems on the Lower East Side are that there are people who are mentally unwell, and the answer to that is treatment for their mental incapacities. So somehow we've got to get them into a treatment center.
Now, so that's a little bit discouraging because we look to Canada, our northern neighbors, as being far advanced than us in drug policy. And the most advanced thing of all was Vancouver with its liberal drug laws and the Portland Hotel Services that we've spoken about. Portland Hotel Services was an organization organized by Liz Evans. She's no longer with them, which was housing. They took homeless people and they own hotels and apartment buildings. They put people in those buildings, and their population was, it's the population of Wormonte formed all those theories about. They're people who had severe emotional difficulties as a group of people. There were a group of people you didn't have to say were experienced trauma because their lives had been horribly traumatized. And Liz Evans had the guts to say, God bless her, as I said, she's no longer there. Well, let's put them in a place to live. A, start there. B, they'll have meals. C, they'll have health care.
And by the way, there was no put them. I know what you mean, but there's no put them anywhere. But invite them, make housing available to them.
Right. And then Liz Evans, she wasn't a philosopher.
She was just nice.
But then she said, well, let's give them jobs. Well, what kind of jobs can we give them? Well, we could start some health food stores and some bakeries. And many of them received these support checks and they couldn't manage it well, or they had no experience with that. So Liz Evans created a bank. So it's the exact opposite approach. Okay, let's give them a place to live. And when you give people a place to live, you're doing two things. It's practical and it's existential. It's your, and Maya Solovitz has spoken about this. You're saying, well, we care about you. We want you to live. We care enough about you. And I've been with Liz Evans when she walked among her clients. She's got a lot to do, but she always indicates to them she cares for them and they know she cares for them. And so that's a model that was in place in Vancouver. She got some government support. And then I don't know where it is now. And I spoke there. Things got screwed up a little around financial irregularities, which I have no knowledge about. And so the question that you and I are thinking about right this second is, everybody's against the drug. Everybody knows the drug war is bad. How can there be a war against drugs? How can we be imprisoning people? And a deeper analysis says, what's a war against drugs mean? How do you fight a war against things? People are the casualties. And now there seems to be at the time when nobody wants to say, oh, I'm for the war on drugs. When that's happening, people are getting more and more into coerced treatment. And sometimes they're able to say, well, we're not for the war on drugs. We want to treat people. But it's bogus. It's a way of saying, well, we're going to put you in jail, A, unless you do what we say, B, which is to go into treatment. And most of the Liz Evans' treatment, even Liz Evans brought me up to Vancouver because she had a substantial AA voice in her organization, which was totally not her instincts. And her instincts are, well, let's do things for people and things will go in a positive direction. She sort of brought me in as a way of being her mouthpiece. And of course, the opposite point of view, which is not harm reduction, and it's not anti-drug war, is to say, oh, we're going to put them in treatment and get them to stop taking drugs. Right. And there was sort of a high point in the United States where there was bilateral agreement on the Housing First program in the United States, and that agreement has now been rescinded. There's something now called Housing Promotes Livelihood and Ultimate Success Act. And that was introduced to Congress by a Republican. And it's a sobriety act. It's a concept of saying, well, go into treatment, go into abstinence treatment, enter recovery, and things will be fine. So under the guise of Housing First, which had appealed to some degree to Republicans and Democrats, we are now rolling it back out of our fear and our reaction to the current drug crisis to make it a treatment-oriented, sobriety meaning abstinence-oriented program, which is, of course, that's just the same as it's always been. It's like the Salvation Army. God bless the Salvation Army. I always enjoy, seeing that movie with, Marlon Brando and Frank Sinatra about, him dating a woman from the Salvation Army. But it's not a drug policy. It's a moral policy. People can go find God if they want and beat a bass drum and stop drinking altogether. But it's not a policy. It's not effective. We know it's not effective. And it recruits a tiny minority of people. I mean, there's just not that many people who are going to say, you know what? My life is in the pits. Why don't I find God and stop drinking? The alternative model, which is called wet housing, which is the alcohol version of Housing First for drug users, it was studied by the great psychologist Alan Marla at the University of Washington. They had a wet housing program where the concept, they have a big Skid Row population. People were getting drunk and dying on the streets. And the logic was the cost effectiveness one. If people are out in the streets and they kept getting rounded up and being hospitalized and put in jail, that's expensive. Mm-hmm. And so in a way, it was created primarily as a financial, not gimmick, but then Marlatt studied that group of people, and they were still what we would call alcoholics. The average amount of drinking was 18 drinks a day, but they cut it back to 12 drinks a day. after 6 months in wet housing.
Because they wound up in a place where people basically accepted them. You know, they don't have to do whatever they're doing in a street corner, or it took away, it alleviated one dimension of whatever their anxieties were about life.
That's the existential, that's the harder to understand reason. The practical reason is it's easier, even if you're not exactly a social drinker, it's easier to control your alcohol supply if you're in a room and you can control it rather than being out in the street where you have to drink the whole thing right away. That's just a practical. So there's a practical,
that's very practical,
an existential reason. And so it wasn't a program geared. They didn't predict that they would drink less, because you're going to say, well, you can drink as much as you want. Why would they drink less?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's worth, as you did, speculating about what that is going on. And it actually produced. Now, if you're drinking 12 drinks a day, that's unhealthy. But it's less unhealthy than drinking 18 drinks a day. I mean, it's stupid to say something so obvious. But remember, these are people who were on the street. Seattle's not as cold as New York, but some were, dying from exposure. The police had to deal with them constantly. Mm-hmm. It's just a hard-headed, practical solution that has existential ramifications. But it takes a certain faith, and it takes a certain moral commitment. And the moral commitment, Liz Evans, Alan Marlatt, who was a pioneer of harm reduction therapy, the sponsors of wet housing, certain political backers, they have to say this, which is something that you and I always emphasize. Harm reduction is about living a better life. Harm reduction is not per se related to how much you drink or take drugs, although in general, your life will probably improve if you're using them in a more controlled manner. We believe that you might want to attempt to eliminate addictive drug and alcohol use. But that's a separate thing. The number of people who sign up to do that, like they do for the Life Process program, perhaps, is only a small minority of the people who need help. And so a national policy has to incorporate, for want of a better term, the least among us, those who are most in need. And to take it one step back further, for people who are inclined to say, oh God, things are really going well, everybody's against the drug war, sort of we have a national harm reduction policy, but undercutting all of that is a residual moral condemnation of drug use and perhaps even drinking and the people who do those things, and an unwillingness to say, as you described, give them the existential, in Buddhism, that total acceptance, that saying, I accept you, which Liz Evans had the gift of giving. You're accepted. We're going to go from here now to give you the best possible life you can have. And so we're here to say what seemed to be progress in a great number of fronts in the directions of genuine harm reduction, of non-punitive approaches to drug use and alcohol use, and to an end to the drug war where you're banging people over the head to get them to do what you want them to do. There seems to be a severe reversal in that situation. We want to identify that, and we certainly want to dig our heels in to make it happen less. And part of the way we want to do that is shake progressives and harm reduction people and then our drug war people and say, what you think you're doing seems humanitarian, but it's not.
Let me just recap what we've gone over. So there's an anti-drug war sentiment among progressive people, and for a while now, that sentiment is rung true. In other words, people using drugs, don't put them in jail. They deserve something better than that. And the something better than that proposed of late is, let's tell them they must go to a treatment place. Now that's despite treatment places basically not working. I mean, and certainly they don't have a success rate of making people stay remit from their drug use or drinking, and they certainly don't provide people the fundamental pillars of life that they need to live a good life. So
You can always make the argument that all of those treatment places, the vast majority of them, if you have to force people to go into them, they wouldn't exist without coercion. They need coercion. The whole substratum of treatment places.
Then you could, there's like a circular argument or an argument where you get stuck, where someone could say, well, these treatment places, maybe we're nudging them in to begin with. Coerced is the better word, but once they get there, they're taken care of. It's not like jail. They'll have a bed. They'll be kind. They'll be people will help them regain skills. To which I would say, then why is it a treatment center? If the thing that you're doing is helping them build on their skills in their lives, why does it need to be under the auspices of treatment? And the real answer is that you have to believe that these people have a disease issue, not a fundamental life issue. The thing that we talked about, Liz Evans, a woman who created housing for people in Vancouver. She gave them housing and then noticed, all right, what's the second order step needed? Because you can't just plop someone in a house who has impoverished skill sets and expect them to just move forward in life. So it's housing, okay, job, okay, you need help with finances. You move from there. What she did, her idea was, how can we help people who seem to need help become part of the warp and the woof of the society in which they live.
And you're providing a community for them as part of this. That was very conscious. They're among people who accept them and are like them in many ways.
And if you bring the ethics back into it, I mean, you have to reason that somebody's saying, well, the answer is easy. Let's just coerce people into treatment. I mean, that's what I'm hearing, and I'm not being charitable, I guess, but what I hear when I hear people say that is like, we would drop a nuke on them all if we could, but we can't. We got to deal with this problem. And people are going to get pissed off at me if we just arrest them all. So, let's do something better than that. Let's put in one extra layer before we do arrest them all. So just different means to the same end. And even if people do.
The way our society can't get out from under the idea that alcohol and drugs are bad things and we need to eliminate them. And that's what our goal is. And that's an underlying. I heard Bill Miller lecture to the great Bill Miller, the motivational interviewing person, lecture to Smart Recovery. And I was shocked to hear him say something like, well, of course, drinking is bad. I mean, I know Bill Miller. I know he drinks beers. There's some fundamental assumption that substance use in and of itself is what we're fighting. You and I in the Life Process program, harm reduction, psychotherapy is communicated by Isla Marlatt. Liz Evans, Portland Hotel Services, have a different concept, which is the human being's life is the critical thing. We deal with that, and that is harm reduction. And then in many cases, they'll have a positive cast off around substance use. But it's a fundamental difference in view.
Well put. So our job was to outline what's going on right now in culture, and that's where we are. I appreciate you bringing up the point.